January 1945. Somewhere west of the Rhine, in the fading glow of a dying lantern, a group of exhausted German staff officers huddle inside what had once been a farmhouse. The stone walls tremble every few minutes as distant American artillery thuds across the frozen night. Snow seeps in through the broken window frames. The smell of wet wool, mud, and burnt fuel hangs thick in the air. On the table before them lies something they were never meant to see. A set of American logistics maps, captured intact during the chaotic retreat that followed the collapse of their defensive line. Thin, colored lines trace routes across Belgium and France. Circles mark fuel depots, ammunition parks, railheads, and supply corridors. Handwritten notations show convoy timetables down to the minute. One officer mutters a quiet curse. Another simply stares in silence, rubbing the bridge of his nose as the realization sinks in. The Americans were not improvising. They were not relying on blind luck or brute force. Every movement, every advance, every division surge had been planned months earlier, supported by a supply system so vast and precise that no German counterattack could truly stop it. And as they study the maps, fatigue gives way to something colder. The understanding that the U.S. Army had created a kind of mobility Germany could never match. A mobility that was still moving toward them. To understand why those captured logistics maps shook German officers so deeply, we must step back to the years before the war, back to a United States that seemed, at least to European strategists, slow, inexperienced, and unlikely to become a decisive military power. It was an assumption rooted in the memory of 1918, when America had arrived late, lacking a professional standing army, relying heavily on borrowed French and British weapons. Many German planners believed that if war ever came again, America would face the same limitations: distance, slow mobilization, and a military culture not built for sustained mechanized conflict. But the United States of the late 1930s was not the country Germany wanted it to be. Beneath its isolationist politics lay an industrial machine without equal. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, Bethlehem Steel, DuPont, Standard Oil. The names alone represented output that dwarfed most of Europe. American factories produced trucks in the hundreds of thousands annually and automobiles by the millions, normalizing mass motorization in a way Germany could only dream of. U.S. highways stretched across vast distances, training millions of civilians in navigation, repair, and long-distance driving long before the first shot of the war was fired. And yet, the true revolution was happening quietly within the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. Learning from the chaos of World War I, the Corps spent 2 decades refining methods for feeding, fueling, and moving large military bodies over long distances. They studied commercial supply chains, railway logistics, and manufacturing distribution networks. They transformed procurement into a science, built standardized packaging systems, streamlined depot operations, and created early forecasting models to predict demand before troops ever reached the battlefield. Even the humble K-ration, simple, boxed, and easily mass-produced, was born out of this pursuit of efficiency. Still, to German observers, America appeared unfocused. Its army ranked 17th in size in 1939. Training was scattered. Equipment varied wildly. Naval policy and army doctrine often contradicted one another. Germany, meanwhile, had conquered Poland, Norway, the Low Countries, and France. Blitzkrieg seemed unstoppable. But America was not idle. As early as 1940, President Roosevelt pushed industry into high gear under the guise of preparedness. Shipyards expanded. Aircraft plants tripled production. Steel output climbed at a pace unmatched anywhere on Earth. And with Lend-Lease in 1941, the United States gained something priceless: practice. It was the largest logistics rehearsal in human history. Before a single American soldier fired a shot in Europe, U.S. factories were already supplying Britain, China, and the Soviet Union. Millions of tons of equipment were assembled, packed, labeled, shipped, tracked, rerouted, and delivered across every ocean of the world. German intelligence noted the shipments but misunderstood the meaning. They assumed such output would strain America. Instead, it trained American logisticians to operate globally. By late 1942, The U.S. had developed a logistics mindset unlike any other, not merely supplying an army, but sustaining an industrial-scale force capable of continuous, offensive, mechanized warfare. This evolution unfolded just as the Axis powers faced increasing strain. Germany's logistics remained a patchwork system. Horse-drawn wagons still formed the backbone of supply. Fuel came from synthetic plants constantly targeted by Allied bombers. Rail networks were overstretched. Replacement vehicles were scarce. Even a short operational pause could cause permanent delays. In contrast, American supply depots expanded like cities. Warehouses occupied entire ports. Conveyor systems, maintenance shops, and rail hubs moved in synchronized rhythms. U.S. planners designed lines of communication that were redundant, layered, and shock-absorbing, capable of rerouting entire armies if roads collapsed or weather shifted. From the desert of Tunisia to the mountains of Italy, the Americans refined their craft, learning how to keep thousands of vehicles moving across enemy territory. All of this, the industrial surge, the logistical philosophy, the supply rehearsals, the quartermaster reforms, formed the unseen foundation beneath the battlefield events of 1944 and 1945. It created an American army that did not simply advance. It accelerated. It consumed terrain at a pace German formations could not comprehend, let alone counter. And this was the world those German officers inhabited in that cold farmhouse as they stared down at the maps. They were not just examining routes and depot points. They were looking at the end of an era in European warfare. An era where mobility had belonged to Germany, now passing irreversibly into American hands. From this point onward, the question was no longer whether U.S. divisions could reach the Rhine. Only when. By late 1942, when American troops entered combat in North Africa, the United States possessed the most advanced logistical theory in the world, but not yet the experience to match it. Tunisia exposed every weakness at once. Inexperienced staff officers miscalculated fuel needs. Convoys arrived late. Supplies piled up in the wrong ports. Ammunition types were mixed, mislabeled, and shipped to the wrong locations. German officers watching the early American performance concluded that the U.S. Army was clumsy, over-equipped, and fundamentally unprepared for large-scale warfare. But they missed the most important thing. The Americans adapted, fast. Every failure became a lesson. Every mistake became a redesign. U.S. logisticians documented errors meticulously and built new procedures within weeks. Depot layouts were reorganized. Port operations were restructured. Truck allocations were standardized. Staff schools revised their curricula in real time. American officers rotated between frontline service and supply headquarters, creating a hybrid mindset rare in any army, commanders who understood both tactics and logistics. By the time U.S. forces pushed into Sicily in July 1943, the transformation had begun. Supply chains tightened. Road networks were mapped and graded. Engineers built bridges faster. Fuel and ammunition dumps expanded with unprecedented precision. Sicily's rugged terrain tested these improvements brutally, but American mobility outpaced Axis expectations. German and Italian rearguards could not disengage fast enough. U.S. troops moved too quickly, sustained by convoys running on predictable timetables. Italy carried the evolution further. Facing mountains, rain, mud, and stubborn German defensive lines, American supply officers learned to calculate consumption down to platoon levels. They coordinated airdropped supplies with truck convoys, railheads, and mule columns. Every advance created new logistical challenges. Every challenge sharpened the system. Still, none of this compared to what would soon happen in northern France. The birth of the Red Ball Express. When Allied troops broke out of Normandy in August 1944, the speed shocked the Germans. For once, the Wehrmacht could not form coherent defensive lines. American divisions were hitting them too fast, too hard, and too widely. But victory created a new threat. The front lines were outrunning the supply ports. Cherbourg was damaged. Other ports remained in German hands. Fuel became dangerously scarce. The United States responded with one of the most extraordinary logistical operations of the war. Within days, planners devised a round-the-clock, two-way highway system dedicated exclusively to supply traffic, the Red Ball Express. Trucks operated in continuous convoys, headlights on day and night, at fixed speeds, with military police clearing intersections to keep the flow uninterrupted. African American drivers, often overlooked in post-war narratives, formed the backbone of the operation, handling dangerous, exhausting shifts with unwavering reliability. At its peak, the Red Ball Express moved 12,000 tons of supplies every day, feeding Patton's Third Army and multiple other divisions across hundreds of miles of open road. No other military had ever done anything like it. To German analysts who still relied heavily on horses, limited trucks, and battered rail lines, this mobility seemed unreal. They intercepted reports of American fuel distribution rates that exceeded what entire German armies consumed. They saw U.S. divisions supported by maintenance companies that could repair broken vehicles within hours. They witnessed captured Sherman tanks return to action faster than German Panthers could be serviced. The structural disparity. By autumn 1944, the imbalance was total. American advantages. Massive truck fleets. Standardized spare parts. Predictable supply timetables. Multiple supply redundancies. Efficient port operations. Unified command structures. Mobile engineer battalions. Fuel access on continental scales. German realities. Rail networks collapsing under Allied bombing. Fuel shortages crippling armored divisions. No standardized parts. Thousands of horse-drawn wagons. Fragmented command and competing priorities. Limited industrial capacity. No strategic reserves. Even before reaching the German border, American mobility had become the central strategic factor of the European campaign. It allowed U.S. forces to recover after setbacks, exploit breakthroughs, and sustain continuous combat operations in ways no Axis army could counter. It was this momentum, this relentless forward drive, that the German officers in early 1945 were trying to understand as they studied the captured maps. They believed logistics were merely the background of war. But now, staring at the layered supply grids and color-coded routes, they saw the truth. Logistics were the war. And the U.S. had turned them into a weapon. The next part of their realization would come when they examined those maps more closely, discovering just how intentionally America had engineered an army that never stopped moving. Long before the captured maps reached German hands, American mobility was being shaped not on battlefields, but in factories, workshops, and engineering offices across the United States. Technology, practical, rugged, standardized, was the quiet force driving U.S. operations forward. The American truck was the foundation. Not glamorous like a Sherman or iconic like AP-51, but far more decisive. GMC, Deuce-and-a-halfs, Studebakers, Fords, Dodges, millions produced, all sharing interchangeable parts. A broken axle, a cracked carburetor, or a blown gasket could be repaired with the same components anywhere from Normandy to the Vosges. German officers, accustomed to vehicles requiring model-specific maintenance, were amazed by the simplicity. Behind the trucks came the engineers. Pipeline units laid fuel lines across liberated terrain, building 1,200 miles of Pluto-style pipelines that pumped gasoline directly from ports to frontline depots. Signal units equipped with radio trucks maintained communication grids resilient to weather and terrain, preventing the delays that plagued German formations. Survey teams mapped roads with precision instruments, marking gradients, traffic limits, and choke points months before operations began. Then there were the depots, massive, organized complexes the size of small towns. Forklifts, cranes, conveyor belts, and standardized packaging allowed supplies to be loaded faster than German units could unload. Even the maps themselves reflected this technological mindset, printed in layered sheets, updated constantly, coded for quick decision-making. When German officers examined these features, they recognized the disturbing truth. American mobility wasn't just a matter of size. It was a matter of engineering discipline. Technology had turned the U.S. Army into a mobile machine, one that could be maintained, fueled, and directed with astonishing speed. And technology, unlike courage or luck, did not tire or retreat. Angle 2. The human angle. War is mechanized, but logistics are human. Every American advance, every road, every convoy, every supply point, depended on hundreds of thousands of men working beyond the headlines, often without recognition. Foremost were the drivers of the Red Ball Express. Many were African American soldiers serving in segregated units, denied combat roles but entrusted with the most critical lifeline of the European theater. They drove under constant danger, exhaustion, mechanical failures, bomber threats, icy roads, and ambushes. Sleep was measured in minutes. Meals were whatever they could grab at way stations. Yet they kept driving, day and night, ensuring Patton's tanks and infantry never ran dry. Behind them were the mechanics, grease-covered, invisible, vital. They repaired thousands of vehicles a week, working under rain, snow, or artillery harassment. Every division relied on them, often without knowing their names. Clerks and quartermasters lived in warehouses, surrounded by endless stacks of crates. They counted, measured, sorted, packed, and labeled with a discipline that shocked German POWs who later described American stores as organized to the centimeter. Engineers built bridges under fire, clearing rivers and ravines to keep the convoys moving. This human network created an army that did not pause. It did not wait for repairs. It did not run short of fuel or ammunition. It simply moved, driven forward by men who rarely slept and often operated far from the front, yet held the fate of entire divisions in their hands. And when German officers studied the supply maps, they realized they were not just looking at routes and depots. They were looking at the work of an entire nation, millions bound together by method, training, and relentless effort. Angle 3. The enemy observes. German intelligence had been watching American logistics since North Africa, but it never truly understood what it was seeing. Early reports dismissed U.S. mobility as excessive, wasteful, or materially extravagant. German officers believed no army could sustain such consumption for long. When American units used 10 times more ammunition or fuel than their German counterparts, observers interpreted it as lack of discipline or tactical inexperience, not as deliberate strategic design. But by 1944, those assumptions began to break. German field commanders noticed that American attacks rarely stalled for lack of fuel. Divisions that were battered one day returned the next, replenished and reinforced. Panzer groups that attempted counterattacks found Americans already redeployed to block them. Even after heavy fighting, U.S. units seemed inexplicably refreshed, fed, rearmed, and reinforced faster than German formations could reposition. Captured reports from German intelligence sections reveal growing alarm. American reserves appear endless. Their transport columns do not diminish even under heavy fire. They fight a war of movement we can no longer match. Yet these observations lacked context until the winter of 1944-45, when intact logistics maps finally fell into German hands. Only then did officers understand the scale of the system they were facing. The Americans weren't appearing everywhere. They were moving everywhere, through a design so robust that even German breakthroughs could not disrupt it. And that realization marked the beginning of a deeper psychological shift, one that would soon intensify as they studied the industrial and command layers behind those same maps. Angle 4. The industrial angle. The backbone of American mobility was its unmatched industrial capacity. Factories in Detroit, Chicago, and Toledo hummed day and night, producing vehicles, spare parts, trucks, and military hardware at scales no other nation could approach. Sherman tanks rolled off assembly lines with standardized components. Jeeps, trucks, and trailers were manufactured in interchangeable batches, allowing rapid replacement in the field. Railways connected every major production hub to port cities. Ships carrying thousands of tons of material left American docks for Europe weekly. Even minor parts, wheels, axles, bearings, were cataloged, boxed, and shipped before divisions even knew they would need them. Germany, by contrast, struggled to keep armored divisions fueled and operational, with repairs often delayed for weeks due to spare part shortages and Allied bombing. Captured German notes later emphasized their disbelief at the system. Entire towns dedicated to war production, supplies already prepositioned, and American factories producing simultaneously for multiple fronts. To German planners, it was not merely overwhelming, it was unimaginable. The industrial machine had become a weapon as decisive as any tank or bomber. It was this scale and efficiency that allowed the U.S. Army to advance relentlessly across France and into Germany. Production did not pause for weather, losses, or enemy action. It continued, fueling divisions that never stopped moving. Angle 5. The command angle. Mobility alone was insufficient without leadership that trusted and leveraged it. American generals like Eisenhower and Patton understood that logistics dictated the tempo of operations. Unlike German commanders, who sometimes gambled on bold maneuvers with thin supply lines, U.S. leadership made careful calculations. Every offensive had a supply plan attached: fuel pipelines, truck convoys, maintenance units, and reserve depots accounted for down to the platoon. Patton's Third Army epitomized this philosophy. He demanded speed, yet relied entirely on the Red Ball Express and logistics coordinators to maintain his advance. Staff officers carried detailed schedules showing when convoys would reach forward units, when fuel would be pumped, when ammunition and rations would arrive. Decisions were rooted in data, not intuition. German officers who later studied these plans were stunned. They realized the Americans were not improvising, they were executing a strategy where logistics and combat operations were inseparable. Leadership had ensured the Army's mobility was consistent, sustainable, and unstoppable. Angle 6. The moral/psychological angle. Perhaps most striking to the Germans was the psychological component of American logistics. U.S. soldiers advanced with confidence, knowing their fuel, ammunition, and rations would always arrive. Even in bitter weather, isolated units rarely faced shortages. This certainty contrasted sharply with the German experience, where limited fuel, collapsing rail networks, and overextended supply lines created panic, hesitation, and fatigue. Prisoners of war recounted the shock of American depots and camps. Food was abundant, vehicles were constantly repaired, and even frontline soldiers were supported by a nationwide industrial network. German officers described their astonishment. They fight as though the nation behind them is invincible. This psychological edge was subtle but decisive. It reinforced every tactical advantage, magnifying the effect of superior mobility. By the time German officers studied the captured maps in early 1945, they understood the full scope. The Americans did not just outgun, outmaneuver, or outnumber them. They had engineered a warfighting system that made hesitation, shortage, and collapse nearly impossible. December 1944. The Ardennes forest lay under a brittle, frost-covered silence. Snow coated the branches, muffling the distant rumble of artillery from the Battle of the Bulge. German officers in makeshift headquarters combed through stacks of captured American maps, still damp from snow and sweat. Lantern light flickered across the room as fingers traced colored lines representing roads, supply depots, fuel points, and ammunition parks. Every color, every symbol, every number conveyed a story of relentless movement that Germany could neither replicate nor interrupt. At first, they scanned mechanically, noting obvious routes: the highways running north toward Bastogne, the secondary roads linking railheads to depots, and the strategically placed refueling points every 25 miles. But as the officers examined the finer details, overlaid convoy timetables, anticipated consumption rates, and vehicle repair schedules, a chilling clarity emerged. This was no ordinary army. No temporary surge of equipment. No improvisation. The United States had created a machine designed to operate continuously, without pause, regardless of terrain, weather, or enemy action. The Ardennes offensive, meant to split Allied lines, had caught some U.S. units off guard, but only briefly. Within days, the Red Ball Express adapted, fueling armored divisions that had advanced hundreds of miles. Trucks, protected by military police and engineers, moved over icy roads at precise intervals. Ammunition and fuel were delivered on schedule. Supplies never halted. German panzer units, advancing with speed but reliant on stretched fuel lines, collided with Americans already prepared, resupplied, and reinforced. Officers whispered to one another, how was it possible that an army could recover this quickly? How could tanks that had fought continuously for days arrive at the next engagement fully fueled and armed? Every answer lay in the maps before them. Pre-calculated supply routes, redundancy built into every line of communication, and contingency plans for destroyed bridges or blocked roads. The Americans had anticipated every obstacle, turning terrain, weather, and enemy action into predictable variables rather than unpredictable risks. One senior staff officer, poring over the numbers, muttered, "They never stop. They can never be stopped." It was not bravado. It was the conclusion of weeks, months, even years of careful observation encoded in the maps. Fuel dumps, rations, spare parts, maintenance depots, all strategically located, all synchronized to ensure that each division could maintain its momentum. The Germans had relied on speed, maneuver, and tactical brilliance, but the Americans had relied on planning, preparation, and execution at a continental scale. The shock was not merely operational, it was psychological. Officers realized that no counterattack, no ambush, no destruction of a single depot could halt an army that had layered redundancies, pre-positioned supplies, and mobile repair units. Their own forces, exhausted and resource-constrained, could never hope to match it. Where German generals saw the potential for breakthrough, the maps revealed an immutable reality. American divisions would continue to advance, resupplied faster than any force could destroy them. By the end of December 1944, the Germans had a clear understanding. The Battle of the Bulge was not just a clash of divisions. It was a confrontation with a logistics system designed to outpace, outlast, and outmaneuver them at every turn. The captured maps crystallized the unspoken truth that had been visible for months. The momentum of American operations was powered not by luck, morale, or heroism alone, but by a meticulously engineered supply network. As officers folded the maps carefully, they understood that the Ardennes offensive had been their last chance to disrupt the American timetable. The Americans would adapt, recover, and continue to push eastward, fueled by roads, trucks, and factories operating with precision the Germans could neither destroy nor comprehend. For the first time, they glimpsed the full scale of the system that had carried U.S. divisions across France in 1944, and that would carry them relentlessly into the heart of Germany in 1945. The realization was stark. Mobility was no longer a tactical advantage. It was a decisive weapon. And the weapon was wielded with cold, calculated efficiency. January 1945. The frozen Rhine Valley stretched beyond the horizon, its forests and hills littered with the remnants of retreating German formations. Patton's Third Army, fueled by an uninterrupted chain of Red Ball Express convoys, surged forward with a velocity that German officers could hardly believe. Every division, every tank battalion, every infantry regiment moved in perfect synchronization, sustained by the very system that had so stunned the officers in the Ardennes. German commanders attempted to mount a defense. Fuel depots were sabotaged, roads mined, bridges destroyed, but each disruption was anticipated. American engineers repaired demolished bridges within hours. Convoys rerouted through secondary roads. Spare trucks replaced damaged vehicles immediately. Supply depots farther back were activated, feeding the forward units without pause. The Americans had transformed the chaos of the battlefield into a predictable, manageable challenge. At Metz, German panzer divisions confronted Patton's armored spearheads. They had numerical parity in some sectors, but the American divisions outpaced them at every turn. Tanks that had fought in multiple engagements that morning were refueled and rearmed before the afternoon. Infantry received fresh rations and ammunition with no delay. Maintenance teams replaced engines, repaired tracks, and prepared vehicles for the next day's advance. German forces could only watch as their counterattacks faltered, not because of bravery or firepower alone, but because the Americans were simply never out of supply. The psychological toll on German officers was immediate. Staff notes captured at this time reveal their disbelief. They fight as though time is on their side. Our strikes are neutralized by their constant resupply. Even elite divisions, Panthers, Tigers, SS Panzergrenadiers, could not sustain momentum when fuel and ammunition ran thin. American logistics, not German courage, dictated the pace and outcome of the engagements. Beyond the battlefield, the maps continued to assert their silent authority. The colored lines, depot locations, and convoy schedules were more than documents. They were a blueprint for relentless operational tempo. Where Germany had relied on improvisation, rationing, and hope, the Americans relied on calculation, redundancy, and execution. The contrast was stark. One side moved by instinct, the other by design. By mid-January, German resistance in the Rhineland began to collapse. U.S. divisions crossed rivers, bypassed fortified positions, and enveloped retreating enemy units. Fuel, ammunition, and food followed immediately, allowing the army to maintain pressure without pause. Each advance validated the German officers' earlier realization at the Ardennes: U.S. divisions would never truly stop, because the system that sustained them was engineered to withstand adversity and counterattack alike. In the frozen light of winter, German commanders finally understood the magnitude of what they were facing. The Americans had not merely outproduced them, outgunned them, or outmaneuvered them, they had outplanned them at a systemic level. Supply routes, maintenance protocols, refueling points, and resupply timetables created a machine that moved faster than the Germans could react. The final and unavoidable truth emerged: the war in Europe, for Germany, was no longer winnable through tactical brilliance alone. The Americans had built a momentum that logistics alone could maintain. Every captured map, every Red Ball convoy, every repaired vehicle reinforced this reality. And as U.S. divisions pressed toward the heart of Germany, German officers had to accept that the relentless rhythm of supply, mobility, and coordination had already determined the outcome. The stage was set for the final months of the European campaign, a campaign dictated not only by soldiers on the front lines, but by roads, depots, trucks, and the invisible architecture of a nation determined to sustain its forces without pause. By March 1945, the consequences of American logistical superiority were undeniable. German officers, reflecting on the captured maps and the relentless pace of U.S. divisions, reported in their post-action notes a stark reality: no German counterattack could match the operational tempo of an army that moved as a cohesive, continuously supplied system. The Ardennes failure had been the final proof. Now, with the Rhine breached and industrial Germany exposed, the Wehrmacht faced an enemy whose mobility was not a fluke of circumstance, but the product of meticulous planning and unyielding execution. Units that had once been considered elite, Panther and Tiger divisions, Waffen-SS brigades, found themselves overextended and undersupplied. Fuel shortages grounded panzers at critical moments. Ammunition ran low in sectors where German artillery had planned concentrated barrages. Even experienced commanders admitted, often in private correspondence or captured diaries, that their operational assumptions had been fatally flawed. They had underestimated the speed and endurance of the U.S. Army. The psychological impact on German officers and soldiers was profound. Captured reports described the astonishment of commanders upon realizing the Americans were not improvising or stretching their supply lines recklessly, they were executing a design that ensured constant forward momentum. One report noted, "Every division moves as though it is guided by a single hand. Supplies arrive before we can strike. Relief never ends." Beyond the battlefield, the captured maps influenced post-war analyses and memoirs. Officers such as General von Mellenthin later reflected on the shock and awe inspired by American logistics. The combination of industrial capacity, planning, and execution had created a force multiplier more decisive than any single tank, bomber, or artillery piece. Germany's failures, in hindsight, were not solely due to battlefield mistakes but to systemic insufficiency. Their logistical network was fragmented, overstressed, and vulnerable to disruption, while the Americans had made disruption nearly impossible. The maps themselves became emblematic of this imbalance. Color-coded lines traced rivers, highways, railheads, and depots. Annotations indicated convoy schedules, refueling points, and spare vehicle caches. German officers realized that U.S. divisions were not only advancing, they were advancing with certainty, knowing exactly where fuel, ammunition, and maintenance would be available. No German assault, ambush, or diversion could alter this rhythm. This understanding marked a turning point in German operational thinking. As U.S. units penetrated deeper into the Rhineland and the Ruhr, the Wehrmacht increasingly shifted from offensive operations to reactive defense. The recognition was universal among senior officers. American mobility, sustained by industrial and logistical mastery, had become a decisive instrument of war. The captured logistics maps were more than strategic intelligence. They were a revelation. They codified the principle that the ability to move and sustain forces continuously across terrain was as lethal as any weapon. And in every frontline engagement that followed, this principle was made manifest. German units could no longer dictate the tempo. The Americans dictated it, with precision, endurance, and inevitability. The consequences of American logistical mastery extended beyond the battlefield, shaping both the final outcome of the European campaign and the post-war understanding of modern warfare. By April 1945, U.S. divisions had crossed the Rhine, encircled the Ruhr, and driven into central Germany, sustaining momentum that left German forces unable to regroup. Supply lines that stretched hundreds of miles from ports in France remained uninterrupted, ensuring that tanks, trucks, and infantry maintained operational readiness without pause. Captured German reports highlighted the systemic shock of this operational rhythm. Wehrmacht officers noted how divisions that had taken heavy losses simply received replacements, fuel, and ammunition faster than the Germans could anticipate. The U.S. Army's ability to reinforce and sustain itself was no longer a tactical advantage. It had become a strategic certainty. One officer wrote, "We have encountered a force whose logistics are a weapon. Every action we take is already anticipated and countered by their planning." Beyond the immediate military outcomes, the maps and operational lessons influenced post-war doctrine. Former German officers, including those who had been shocked by the Ardennes and Rhineland campaigns, studied U.S. logistical methods extensively. The focus shifted to understanding how industrial capacity, transportation networks, and supply chain planning could determine the tempo and outcome of modern war. NATO planners, for instance, would later adopt principles directly derived from American operations in Europe: redundancy, rapid mobility, and integrated maintenance and fuel systems. On the human level, the consequences were equally visible. U.S. soldiers advanced with confidence, morale bolstered by the certainty that no unit would be left stranded, underfed, or underarmed. In contrast, German morale deteriorated as the war's momentum consistently favored the Americans. The psychological advantage of being well supplied became apparent. Where German units hesitated, American units surged. Where the Germans lacked fuel or ammunition, U.S. divisions maintained relentless pressure. The aftermath also reinforced a broader historical lesson. Victory in industrialized warfare depended as much on logistical design as on battlefield heroics. The maps captured in late 1944 represented more than roads and depots. They encoded a philosophy of war in which planning, production, and mobility were inseparable from combat power. German officers, stunned by this revelation, recognized too late that the Americans had created an army that could not be stopped, only outlasted. A task Germany was no longer capable of accomplishing. The stage was thus set for the final collapse of the Third Reich. By May 1945, German resistance had crumbled, not solely from tactical defeats, but from the systemic pressure exerted by an army whose mobility, planning, and logistics operated at a level Germany could never replicate. The captured maps remained a testament to the invisible machinery behind the battlefield victories, proof that logistics, often overlooked, had become the decisive weapon of the war. The story of the captured logistics maps is a reminder that warfare is fought not only with bullets, tanks, or bombs, but with organization, foresight, and relentless preparation. German officers had expected to confront divisions slowed by supply shortages, fatigued troops, and fragile fuel lines. Instead, they faced a force that moved with the certainty of an entire nation behind it, a system designed to sustain itself through any adversity. Mobility became more than a tactical advantage. It became a strategic weapon. The United States demonstrated that industrial capacity, planning, and discipline could transform an army into an unstoppable machine. Every convoy, Every depot, every calculated supply route contributed not just to battlefield success, but to the broader psychological dominance of the campaign. Where the Germans hesitated, the Americans advanced. Where German forces ran short, American units were reinforced before shortages could be felt. The very infrastructure of logistics dictated the tempo, the opportunities, and ultimately, the outcome of the war. The captured maps, now historical artifacts, symbolize the invisible backbone of victory. They reveal that the fate of armies, and even nations, can hinge on the meticulous orchestration of movement, fuel, ammunition, and manpower. The realization that German officers experienced in that cold farmhouse underscores a timeless truth. Preparation, precision, and mobility can outweigh bravery or tactical skill when applied systematically. In the end, the lesson extends beyond the battlefields of Europe. Modern warfare, technological or conventional, continues to rely on systems as much as firepower. Supply lines, planning, and coordination remain decisive. The American success in 1944-45 reminds us that a nation's strength is measured not only by its weapons, but by its ability to sustain, support, and move them effectively. For the German officers who first traced those colored lines, it was a moment of revelation and humility. They saw that victory was not a matter of luck or battlefield genius. It was the consequence of an army designed to never stop moving. And in that realization lay a quiet, immutable truth. The machinery of logistics had already determined the outcome of the war.